Snow fell that morning like it had been waiting years to return. Thick, slow, and mercilessly quiet. Each flake found its way onto the shoulders of Mary Whitfield as she swung her axe into the log, breath rising in white ribbons against the dawn. Her cabin sat on the edge of a frozen world, pine forest on one side, a field of ghosts on the other. Some days, she thought she could still hear her husband's laughter echoing through the timbers he had built. Now only the wind answered back. The stove inside was dying, and the cold bit through her gloves like a punishment she had long accepted. Every motion was deliberate: chop, lift, carry, each one keeping her from thinking too hard about how quiet her life had become. The townsfolk 3 miles away had stopped visiting after the second winter alone. Some whispered she'd gone strange in her grief, others said she'd chosen it. In truth, loneliness had chosen her, settling into her bones like frost that never melts. When she returned inside, her breath followed her through the door, trailing into the dim light. The fire gave off a tired orange glow, throwing her shadow against the walls. She hung her shawl, rubbed her hands, and stood for a long time before the window. The sky had turned the color of pewter. Out there, everything looked both dead and clean, like the world before God's first breath. She whispered to the silence, as she did every morning, "Another day then." The kettle hissed. She poured herself tea, and sat at the table with her back to the empty chair across from her. The cup trembled slightly in her hands. For a moment, she closed her eyes, trying to remember what it felt like to laugh without guilt. Then came the sound, a hollow knock, distant and strange. Her body froze. No one came this far in winter. She waited, thinking it might have been the wind playing tricks. But the knock came again, heavier this time, echoing through the small cabin. She reached for the rifle by the door, thumb brushing the worn wood. When she opened it, a gust of snow swept in, stinging her face. 2 shapes stood in the white blur, a man and an older figure leaning on him. The younger was tall, broad-shouldered, hair dark and tied back beneath a layer of frost. His eyes were dark amber, steady but cautious. The older man had hair as white as the snow itself, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. "We seek shelter," the younger said, his voice low, roughened by cold and exhaustion. His accent carried something foreign, melodic even in brevity. Mary's first instinct was to close the door. She'd heard the stories the town spun about Apache men: wild, untrustworthy, dangerous. But the old man's knees buckled, and the younger caught him just before he fell. For a heartbeat, she saw not strangers but the image of her late husband carrying his dying father years ago, both men laughing weakly against hardship. "Come in," she said, the words surprising even her. The young man hesitated, studying her face for deceit. Then he half carried the elder inside. Snow clung to their clothes, melting onto her floor. The elder collapsed onto the nearest chair, gasping faintly, his face hollowed by the cold. Mary shut the door against the wind and moved quickly. Another log on the fire, her old quilt over the man's shoulders. The younger man stood by the wall, still and silent, eyes sharp but unreadable. He was handsome in a way that didn't belong to this place, something ancient and patient about him, like the mountains themselves. "You'll freeze if you stand there," she murmured, keeping her tone soft but firm. "Sit. The fire's for everyone." He obeyed, wordless. The room filled with the sound of dripping snow, the hiss of wet boots near heat. Mary poured what little broth she had left into a pot, her movements brisk, practical. She could feel his gaze on her, not hostile, not curious but measuring. When the old man stirred, whispering something in a tongue she didn't know, she leaned closer. The young man translated quietly. "He says, 'Thank you.'" "Tell him he's welcome," she replied, though her voice broke slightly. They ate without speaking. The elder's hands trembled around the bowl, but he finished every drop. The young man, Talon, he called himself when she asked, ate slowly, as if unused to being treated as a guest. When she refilled his bowl, his eyes lifted to hers briefly, an acknowledgement without words. Outside, the wind rose. Snow piled against the door, sealing them into that fragile warmth. When they had finished, she gathered the bowls, suddenly aware of the quiet hum between them. The older man had fallen asleep beside the fire, his breathing even now. Talon sat watching the flames, shoulders relaxed for the first time. Mary noticed how his hands, though calloused and rough, rested carefully on his knees, like a man taught restraint in a world that offered him none. "You're far from your people," she said at last, voice low. He nodded once. "My father is sick. We traveled south, hoping for milder air." His gaze drifted toward the sleeping man. "The cold was stronger than we thought." She nodded too, unsure what to say that wouldn't sound foolish. The air between them thickened with unspoken things: fear, trust, hunger, memory. As the night deepened, she laid an extra blanket near the fire for Talon. "You can rest here," she said. "You'll be safe till morning." He hesitated, as though safety were a word he didn't believe in. But when she turned away, he finally settled near his father. Later, as she sat by the window, watching the snow swallow the horizon, she wondered why she hadn't turned them away. The cabin had been her fortress, her penance, her proof that she could survive alone. But tonight it felt less like armor and more like a cage. Her eyes drifted toward the fire. The older man's face glowed faintly in the light, peaceful now. Talon slept sitting up, head bowed slightly, hair falling over his brow. Something in her chest stirred, something she thought had long frozen over. When she finally went to bed, the silence didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt alive, filled with new breath. She lay awake, listening to the rhythm of their breathing from the other room, until sleep took her. Before dawn, a sound woke her again. A deep, hacking cough. She rushed out to find the old man shivering violently despite the fire. Talon knelt beside him, murmuring in his language, helpless frustration shadowing his face. Mary fetched more blankets, her fingers trembling as she touched the old man's burning forehead. "His fever's high," she said softly. "He needs warmth." Talon met her eyes then, raw, pleading, stripped of the guarded calm he'd carried all night. In that instant, something passed between them. The understanding that survival, for all its pride, was nothing without mercy. She brought another quilt, her last one, and tucked it around the elder. The fire roared higher. The young man's voice softened as he spoke to his father again, something like a prayer. Hours crawled by. The old man's breathing steadied, the fever easing just as the first light crept across the snow. Mary leaned back in her chair, exhaustion sinking into her bones. Talon looked at her with quiet astonishment, as though he couldn't quite believe someone had chosen kindness instead of fear. "You saved him," he said, almost in wonder. She smiled faintly. "Maybe he saved me first." He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded, eyes on the rising dawn outside the window, where the world was pale and new. When the sun broke through the clouds, light spilled across the cabin floor, touching all three of them. For the first time in years, Mary felt warmth that wasn't just from the fire. And then, just as peace began to settle, there came a distant crunch of hooves in the snow. Horses. Voices. Talon rose, every line of his body tensing. Mary turned toward the window, heart pounding. Out there at the edge of the white field, shadows moved. Men on horseback approaching her cabin. The quiet they had found was about to end. Morning light spilled over the snow like pale silk, soft and merciless. Mary stood at the window, one hand resting on the cold sill, watching the horizon blush with dawn. Outside, Talon was already awake, his tall frame moving through the frost-laden yard, splitting wood in rhythmic silence. Each strike echoed through the still air, steady as a heartbeat. He wore no coat, only a dark shirt rolled at the sleeves, muscles flexing beneath the thin fabric. Steam rose from his breath. Mary had never seen anyone move with such quiet strength, as though he carried the storm but refused to let it rule him. Her first thought wasn't fear, but gratitude. For the first time in years, smoke curled from her chimney not because she'd begged the fire to live, but because someone else had chosen to feed it. She brewed coffee and poured 3 tin cups, setting one near the sleeping elder. The old man murmured in his language, half dreaming, his face peaceful in the flicker of the flames. Talon returned soon after, snow clinging to his boots. He paused at the door, eyes flicking from her to the warmth inside, asking wordlessly if he might enter. "You can come in," she said. "You don't have to ask." He nodded, brushing snow from his hair, and sat cross-legged by the fire. When she handed him the cup, his fingers brushed hers, rough, calloused, startlingly warm. For a moment, both froze. He lowered his eyes in respect, murmuring, "Thank you." She busied herself at the table, pretending calm. "Your father's better. The fever's eased." Talon looked toward the old man and exhaled softly, relief melting the hardness in his face. "He is strong. But old." He hesitated, then added, "You helped him. You didn't have to." Mary glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "No one deserves to die cold." Silence grew between them, not empty, but full of everything neither knew how to say. The fire popped softly, snow whispered against the glass, and somewhere outside a crow called once, lonely and distant. Later, while the elder slept, Mary stepped outside to fetch more water from the well. Talon followed without speaking, carrying the heavy bucket easily. She tried to refuse, but he only shook his head. "You have done enough." His voice was low, careful, as if each English word were chosen like a stone laid on sacred ground. As they walked back, he paused to look toward the ridge where smoke rose faintly in the distance. "Town?" he asked. "Yes. 3 miles." She hesitated. "They don't take kindly to visitors." His lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "They don't take kindly to us." She didn't answer. The truth sat heavy between them. When they returned to the cabin, she noticed how he stepped aside for her to enter first, an unspoken courtesy that felt oddly intimate. She set the bucket down and began slicing bread for supper. He sat near the fire again, mending a tear in his father's coat with careful stitches. His large hands moved slowly, almost tenderly. Watching him, Mary realized that strength could live quietly, that gentleness could exist even in those the world called savage. By afternoon, the storm had thinned to a soft flurry. She brought a blanket to the porch and sat, staring at the endless white. After a while, Talon joined her. They sat side by side without speaking, listening to the snow melt from the roof in slow, rhythmic drops. "You miss someone," he said finally, not a question but an understanding. Mary's throat tightened. "My husband. 3 winters ago." Talon nodded once. "I know that kind of silence." She turned to him, curious. "Your wife?" He shook his head. "No. My people. My home." Their eyes met for the briefest moment, hers bright with old pain, his shadowed by exile. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her grief. That evening, as the light faded, the sound of hooves shattered the fragile peace. Mary stiffened. Through the frosted window she saw the sheriff's horse standing by the gate, its breath rising like smoke. Sheriff Amos Dunn dismounted heavily, his face red from the cold and from drink. Talon stood instantly, his jaw tightening, but Mary's hand lifted in quiet warning. "Stay!" She stepped outside, pulling her shawl close. The sheriff tipped his hat without warmth. "Heard tell you've got company out here," he drawled. "2 Apache men, that right?" "They're not trouble," she said, forcing her voice steady. He looked past her toward the window where Talon's shadow moved. "Can't have that sort round these parts. Folks are uneasy enough." Mary's pulse quickened. "They're just trying to survive the winter. His father's ill." Amos leaned on his saddle, smirking. "Ill's one word for it. I'd be careful, Miss Whitfield. Mercy can get a woman hurt." She held his gaze, trembling inside but unwilling to show it. "So can cruelty." The sheriff's jaw twitched. He spat into the snow and turned his horse. "You've got a kind heart, Mary. Don't let it be your ruin." With that, he rode off, leaving hoof prints like scars in the white. When she went back inside, Talon was standing near the fire, fists clenched. "He threatened you?" "No," she said softly. "He warned me." "Same thing." She met his eyes, surprised by the protectiveness burning there. "I've lived with worse words, Talon. Let it rest." He exhaled, shoulders easing slightly. "You should not live afraid." "Neither should you," she whispered. The elder stirred in his sleep then, breaking the tension. Mary returned to her chair and poured more coffee, her hands shaking. She didn't know what frightened her more, the sheriff's warning, or how much she wanted this silence to last. Hours passed. Night deepened. Talon took his seat again by the fire, the orange light tracing the lines of his face. Mary felt his presence like warmth that reached beyond the flames. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "You have a strong heart." She smiled faintly. "Strong hearts break too." He nodded as if he understood perfectly. Then, with a slow movement, he reached toward the fire and added another log. The sparks rose between them, gold against the dark. When she went to bed, she left her door open for the first time, not out of fear but trust. Near midnight, she woke to the sound of murmured words. Talon's voice, low and steady, speaking in his language. She rose quietly and peeked through the doorway. He sat beside his father, who slept peacefully, the younger man's head bowed in reverence. For the first time, she saw him not as a stranger but as a son, devoted, weary, carved by loss. Something in her chest shifted, a warmth she hadn't felt since before the world turned cold. Outside, the wind eased. The storm had passed, leaving only silence and the fragile heartbeat of the fire. Mary lay awake, eyes open to the ceiling beams, thinking of the sheriff's words, of Talon's hands, of the way the snow had melted from his hair when he first stepped through her door. By dawn, she knew something had changed. The quiet between them wasn't emptiness anymore. It was something living, something that scared her more than solitude ever had. And far off, faint but growing, came the echo of a new sound. Church bells from town. The first Sunday in months she had not gone alone. The first thaw came early that winter, a deceitful whisper of warmth sliding through the valley before the snow closed again around it. The stream beside Mary's cabin cracked open in ribbons of silver, and for a brief day the air smelled faintly of earth instead of frost. She stood outside hanging linens to dry, the damp fabric snapping in the wind, when she saw two riders far off on the ridge, tiny against the white horizon. They didn't stop, but she felt their eyes on her. That evening, when she went to fetch water, she noticed boot prints in the snow near the well, too large to be her own. By morning, the whispers had reached town. At the general store, Mrs. Harper leaned over the counter, her voice honeyed and cruel. "Did you hear, Amos? She's taken to keeping company with those Indians. Says they're guests. Imagine that." Her laugh was sharp, cutting through the smell of kerosene and coffee beans. Sheriff Dunn said nothing, only thumbed the edge of his hat and frowned. But silence in a small town was agreement enough. Mary heard their judgment before she even set foot in town. The air felt different, charged, watchful. She needed medicine for Elder Greyhawk's cough, which had worsened since the storm, and her chest burned with the weight of duty and dread. As she entered the apothecary, every conversation seemed to pause. Men looked away. Women stared openly. She kept her chin high, though her throat ached with shame. "Afternoon, Miss Whitfield," said Dr. Avery without looking up from his ledger. "Can't say I've seen you in a while." "I need quinine," she said, her voice clipped. "And willow bark if you have it." He turned a page deliberately. "And who's the patient?" She hesitated. Lying would be easier. "A man. He's ill from the cold." Avery's eyes lifted then, narrow, suspicious. "A man from town?" "No." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack. He closed the ledger and folded his hands. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield. I can't supply medicine without proper record. And I surely can't be selling to anyone harboring savages." Her jaw tightened. "He's a dying man." "Then God can tend him." She left the shop without another word, the bell above the door shrieking her shame to the whole street. The cold bit her cheeks as she walked home, faster and faster until the cabins of town shrank behind her, and the woods swallowed her up again. Inside her home, the old man's breath rasped against the firelight, shallow and uneven. Talon knelt beside him, a bowl of broth cooling untouched. His eyes rose the moment she entered, searching her face. She set the bundle of useless herbs on the table. "They wouldn't sell." He said nothing at first. Then, quietly, "You went for him? Into town?" She nodded. "They saw me." His gaze darkened with something like guilt. "It will bring you trouble." She sat beside the fire, rubbing her numb hands. "I've already had worse." They worked through the night, using her grandmother's old remedies, boiled pine needles for fever, crushed juniper berries for breath. She pressed damp cloths to the old man's forehead while Talon murmured words she couldn't understand, prayers maybe, or promises. Hours stretched long and fragile. Just before dawn, Elder Greyhawk's breathing steadied. The fever broke like ice giving way to water. Mary slumped back in her chair, exhausted. Talon looked at her as though he'd never seen a woman before, at least, not one capable of defying both death and the world's scorn in a single night. "You saved him again," he said softly. She gave a faint smile. "I think he saved himself this time." He shook his head, the firelight catching in his eyes. "My people say the spirits move through kindness. You have that gift." Her gaze dropped to the floorboards. "If kindness were a gift, the town wouldn't hate me for it." For a while, the only sound was the wind nudging against the windows. Then, almost shyly, Talon asked, "You care what they say?" Mary hesitated. "I care that they'll come here. And they will." He looked to his father, then back at her. "Then I will leave when he's strong enough." Something inside her twisted. The thought of this cabin going silent again, of returning to that unbearable stillness, felt like being buried alive. But she only nodded. "You'll do what you must." In the days that followed, the tension outside the cabin grew like a storm waiting for lightning. Tracks appeared in the snow near the treeline, men watching from afar. Once, a bullet shell gleamed in the sunlight just beyond her fence, left there like a warning. Talon stayed close, his movements quiet but alert. When he wasn't tending to his father, he repaired her roof, split firewood, mended the old gate that had been hanging for years. He never asked permission. He simply worked, and every small act became a language between them. She would find a loaf of bread left near his tools, or he'd add wood to the stove before she woke. They spoke less now, but every silence was charged with the weight of what couldn't be said. One evening, Mary caught him watching her as she brushed snow from her shawl. Their eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stop. He looked away first, as though afraid of what might happen if he didn't. That same night, she found Elder Greyhawk awake, his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. He reached for her hand and whispered something faint. Talon translated. "He says your heart is louder than fear." Tears stung her eyes, but she only smiled and pressed his frail hand gently. By morning, Talon had gone to gather firewood from the forest ridge. Hours passed, and he didn't return. When the sun began to sink, unease coiled through her stomach. The silence outside felt wrong. She stepped out into the snow, the wind biting her cheeks. The trail of his footprints vanished beyond the bend of the trees. Then she heard it, a shout, then another. Men's voices. The sound of struggle. Mary ran. Branches whipped at her face, her boots breaking through crusted snow. She found them near the ridge, 2 men from town, one holding a rifle, the other clutching Talon's arm. Blood stained the sleeve of his shirt. "Let him go!" she cried, breathless, stumbling toward them. The man with the gun turned, startled. "Back off, Mary. He was trespassing on Harper land. He was gathering wood. That's what they all say." The gun lifted. Mary stepped between them before she had time to think. "You'll have to shoot through me." For a moment, no one moved. The wind screamed through the pines. Then the man spat on the snow and lowered the rifle. "You're mad," he muttered. "Both of you." They left, their curses trailing into the cold. When they were gone, Mary turned to Talon. His arm bled freely now, crimson soaking into the snow. She tore her scarf and pressed it against the wound. "Why didn't you fight them?" she demanded. His voice was faint, almost ashamed. "Because you were watching." She looked up at him, startled. His meaning sank in slowly. He hadn't wanted her to see him become what the town believed he was. They walked back in silence, her shoulder beneath his as the last light bled out of the sky. Inside, she cleaned the wound, hands trembling. When she tied the bandage, their faces were inches apart. His breath mingled with hers, warm and uneven. "You risked yourself," he whispered. "So did you," she said. Their eyes held, unblinking, until Elder Greyhawk coughed softly from the bed. The moment broke like glass. She pulled away, cheeks flushed. "Rest," she said, her voice low. "We'll talk when it's light." But later, as she sat by the fire watching him sleep, she realized there were no words for what had begun between them, only the quiet, dangerous truth of it. Outside, wolves cried to the moon, their howls threading through the forest. The snow started again, gentle and endless, erasing the blood they'd left behind. And far down the valley, in the town where fires still burned and tongues wagged, Mrs. Harper leaned close to Sheriff Dunn and whispered, "It's true. She's fallen for him." The sheriff looked toward the mountains, where a single chimney smoked against the storm, and said, "Then come morning, we'll pay her a visit." The night was heavy with silence, thick and trembling like the breath before a storm. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing deep red in the hearth. Mary sat awake, her shawl wrapped tight, listening to the rhythmic rasp of Elder Greyhawk's breathing, and the faint crack of ice melting on the roof. Sleep had abandoned her long ago, replaced by the steady pulse of dread that had taken root since she saw the men on the ridge. She knew they would come back. Men like Sheriff Dunn always did. Talon sat near the door, sharpening his knife by firelight. The blade whispered against the stone, a patient sound that calmed her even as it frightened her. His wound had healed enough for him to move freely again, though the bandage at his arm was still faintly stained. His eyes lifted when she shifted in her chair. "You should rest," he said softly. "So should you," she replied. He gave a small, tired smile. "I am not tired. Only waiting." "For what?" "For the world to show its teeth." Before she could answer, the wind outside changed. Sharp, slicing, carrying voices. Hoofbeats thudded in the distance, faint but closing. Mary rose, her pulse hammering. Talon stood in one fluid motion, slipping the knife into his belt. They exchanged a single look, no fear, only understanding. The door shuddered under a sudden blow. Elder Greyhawk stirred in his sleep, whispering his son's name. Talon moved closer to the door, his hand steady on the latch. Mary placed herself beside the fire, forcing her voice not to shake. "Don't," she said quietly. "If you open it, they'll shoot first." Another blow came, louder. "Open up, Mary Whitfield." Sheriff Dunn's voice, hoarse and commanding. "You've had fair warning. Those men leave now, or you'll answer for it." Talon turned to her, eyes fierce. "You stay behind me." "No," she said, stepping forward. "This is my home." When the next strike came, the door gave way. Snow burst inward, wind and ash swirling through the cabin. 3 men stood outside, Dunn in front, rifle raised, 2 others flanking him. Behind them, the dawn was just beginning to color the horizon in bruised red. Dunn's eyes swept the room, stopping on Talon. "Told you she'd choose wrong company," he muttered. "Step aside, Mary." "I won't," she said. Her voice was calm now, frighteningly calm. "You'll not drag them out into the cold like dogs." Dunn's jaw clenched. "You're protecting killers. They haven't harmed anyone. They don't need to." He aimed the rifle. "One less savage in this valley and we all sleep easier." Talon moved before the trigger pulled, a blur of strength. He grabbed the barrel and twisted it aside. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the small room. Sparks flew as the bullet struck the stove, scattering embers across the floor. Dunn stumbled back, cursing, while his men raised their weapons. Mary shouted, "Stop! Stop this!" But no one listened. Talon shoved Dunn hard, sending him sprawling into the snow outside. One of the deputies fired, wood splintered near Mary's shoulder. She ducked, smoke filling her lungs. The cabin filled with chaos, shouting, the crack of gunfire, the roar of the fire as it caught the curtain. "Talon!" she cried. The flames raced up the wall, hungry and fast. He turned toward her, his face streaked with soot. "Get your father." She ran to the bed where Elder Greyhawk lay coughing violently, flames reflecting in his watery eyes. "We have to go," she whispered, lifting him with trembling arms. He was light as driftwood, but her strength was fading. Talon rushed to her side, taking his father easily, cradling him close. Smoke swirled around them. Dunn staggered back to his feet outside, rifle reloaded. "Enough!" he shouted. "You'll burn with them if you don't stand down." Talon stepped into the doorway, the old man in his arms, the fire at his back casting him in gold and blood-red light. His voice carried through the wind. "You speak of law," he said, "but you know nothing of honor." Dunn's hands trembled. He fired again, but the shot went wide. The recoil knocked him backward. Mary, coughing hard, stumbled out behind Talon, dragging a blanket she'd soaked in water to shield them. Flames devoured the cabin behind her, roaring louder than the wind. They made it a few yards before Elder Greyhawk's body went still. Talon froze mid-step, lowering his father to the snow. The old man's eyes were open but distant, reflecting the burning cabin's light. His lips moved faintly. Talon knelt, pressing his forehead to his father's. "Go in peace," he whispered in his own tongue. "You are home." Mary knelt beside him, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. The fire crackled behind them, its glow flickering like the end of a prayer. When she looked up, the sheriff and his men were still there, guns lowered now, faces pale. Something in the stillness of that moment. Talon bowed over his father, Mary's hand on his shoulder, stripped them of all their righteousness. Dunn cleared his throat, unable to meet her eyes. "Didn't mean for this," he muttered, his voice small. "Didn't mean." But the words dissolved in the wind. He turned his horse without another word and rode away, his men following, their figures swallowed by the rising dawn. For a long while, only the fire spoke. The cabin collapsed in on itself, sparks rising into the lightning sky. Talon stayed kneeling until the last wall fell, smoke curling around him like incense. Mary touched his arm gently. "We'll bury him on the hill," she said. He nodded, voice too rough for words. Together, they dug through frozen ground until the first rays of sunlight touched the earth. When they laid the old man down, the world was utterly still. Mary whispered a prayer she barely remembered from childhood, and Talon added his own in the Apache tongue. Two different faiths braided in one breath. Afterward they stood side by side, hands red with dirt, faces streaked with ash. The fire had taken everything she owned, yet Mary felt lighter than she had in years. The silence that lingered between them was no longer born of fear. It was something sacred, something understood. "You can go," she said finally, voice breaking. "No one will stop you now." Talon looked at her, snow melting in his hair, eyes reflecting the pale pink sky. "And leave you here?" She hesitated. "You have your own people." He shook his head slowly. "Maybe not anymore." She met his gaze, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The wind eased. The sun rose, casting gold over the white field and the grave at their feet. Without speaking, she took his hand. It was rough and warm, trembling slightly in hers. He didn't pull away. They stood like that until the light turned the snow to fire, and the smoke from her ruined cabin thinned into the sky. Somewhere in that quiet dawn, the loneliness that had defined them both melted away. And when Mary finally spoke, her voice was soft, steady, certain. "Then stay."